Hi everyone, and welcome to our Gen Talk on sociological research. This really is an overview of the types of research sociologists do. First, let's talk about sociological research. Like all sciences, sociology is an empirical or systematic study of society. Whenever you see a word that ends in ology, it's the study of. And of course, the first part then is what it is the study of. In this case, SOCI is short for society. Sociology is the empirical, systematic study of society. Sociologists empirically study through various methods and approaches, just like biologists, chemists, geologists, physicians, pharmacologists, psychologists. All of us empirically study the concepts that we're interested in. Science seeks to support or disprove theories. We've talked about the different sociological theories: conflict theory, functionalism, symbolic interactionism, and postmodernism. You can have a theory, but it's not really worth much unless you have tested it. Sociologists can engage in two types of research method approaches. They can be quantitative, which focus on data that can be measured numerically, like your age, your income, the frequency that something happens, the frequency or rating in which someone rates something, like strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree. Those are all numerical ways of looking at opinions, etc. We can also do qualitative research. Here we focus on descriptions made of words and patterns of behaviors through observations. And we can also have a mixed methods approach in which we include quantitative and qualitative methods. I definitely preferred mixed methods because then you're really capitalizing on the benefits of both. Now let's talk about how sociologists actually do research. First of all, theories generate specific hypotheses. Remember, theories were overarching large conceptual statements. Hypotheses get more specific about potential correlations or possible cause and effect. For example, cyberbullying leads to an increase in suicide among teens. That's a hypothesis, right? Playing violent video games leads to viewers to engage in more violent acts than those who do not play violent video games. That's also a hypothesis. Both of these actually are rooted in symbolic interactionism. Once we generate a hypothesis, we need to test it by creating research questions. An increase in cyberbullying is positively correlated with a significant increase in suicide attempts among a specific community. Maybe that community is a particular high school, a county, a state, etc. That is the research question based on our first hypothesis above. Another research question based on our hypothesis focusing on video games is this. We'll actually focus on that one in a few minutes. Now we can test this hypothesis, but we need to focus on key variables. So what are variables? Variables have measurable traits that can change or vary, like incidence of cyberbullying and incidence of suicide attempts. Those are variables. In science, we measure variables that affect other variables: an independent variable and a dependent variable, or independent and dependent variables. Independent variables are hypothesized to cause or affect change in other variables. Those other variables are the dependent variables. We're going to keep it simple and focus on one independent and one dependent variable, but in fact, one study could have many independent and dependent variables affecting one another. Dependent variables are hypothesized to be affected by changes in the other variables or the independent variables. So the independent variable, as it changes, affects the dependent variable. That's what we hypothesize. If there's no change happening, our hypothesis is incorrect. If there is change and it's significant, then our hypothesis can be correct. What are the independent and dependent variables in our research question? Is the increase in cyberbullying positively correlated with a significant increase in suicide attempts in a specific community? Which variable is said to affect the other? Take a look. If you said cyberbullying or the incidence of cyberbullying, then you got the independent variable. What is cyberbullying said to affect? What it is said to affect is the dependent variable. Which variable is said to be affected by the other? Which variable is said to be affected by cyberbullying or the independent variable? Okay, let's see. If you said suicide attempt rates as the dependent variable, you're correct. Now let's try the other one on violence in video games. If the dependent variable increases as the independent variable increases, and that increase is considered significant, we won't worry for this lesson how to determine significance. Let's just use the word significant and know that it's a lot. Then your hypothesis is supported by your empirical research. Violent video games and an increase in violence is our next example. So our hypothesis is playing violent video games leads viewers to engage in more violent acts than those who do not play in violent video games. That's our hypothesis, so we need a research question. Does an increase in playing violent video games lead to a significant increase of violence in video game players? Do those who play violent video games engage in violent acts more than those who do not play violent video games? So what are the variables? Violent video game playing and acts of violence. Which is the independent variable? Which one is said to cause an effect in the other? The violent video game playing, right. Which is the dependent variable, or the one that's affected by the independent variable then? The acts of violence that happen afterwards. If you see an increase, then your hypothesis may be correct. Now let's talk about research methods specifically, the things that we use to discover our answers to our research questions based on hypotheses which are generated out of theory. There are many methods that sociologists use to explore sociological phenomena, or the relationship between independent and dependent variables. 4 major methodological types are experiments, surveys and questionnaires, which I lump together. Your book separates them out. Focus on the information that I provide in this slide. It's a little bit more accurate. Secondary analysis of data and field research. And I'll give you a hint. Things are more quantitative at the top of this list and more qualitative at the bottom. Let's first talk about experiments. The most quantitative and the most likely to create a cause and effect or close to cause and effect relationship. Experiments are quantitative. They're carefully designed studies in a lab or a controlled setting or environment. Subjects are randomly assigned to groups, an experimental group and a control group. That way you know that there's equal chance for people to be assigned to one group or another, so that we know that the groups are essentially equal in various characteristics. The independent variable is manipulated in the experimental group. Nothing is manipulated in the control group. So in the control group, people just go about life as they normally would. In the experimental group, something is changed to see if there's an impact when that change occurs. The groups are compared afterwards to assess if there's a significant difference in the dependent variable. Let's take a look at or consider the pretest that we took in this course. We took a pretest in this course. If I had chosen 2 groups, one group that is taking our class and one group that's not, and they were randomly assigned, and you all had been the randomly assigned group to take the course, you would be in my experimental group, and the other students who are not taking the course would be the control group. You do the pretest to see what the baseline is, or where all of your understanding is in sociology. And since people would have been randomly assigned to taking the class or the experimental group and not taking the class or the control group, you'd all come with, as a group, you'd be pretty equal. A couple people having some understanding, many people with a little, and many people with none. The treatment, or the independent variable, is the class, the learning that we do in the class. And at the end, we'll have the post-test to see if there's any change. With the control group, we'd give them the post-test again. Now, they would not have encountered any sociological learning unless they did by chance, whereas you were intentionally engaging in sociological learning. So my hypothesis is those of you who are in the class are going to have increased learning due to the learning, or increased understanding of sociology due to the learning in this class. The learning in this class is the independent variable. And the understanding of sociology is the dependent variable. The experimental group is those who are in the class, and the control group are those who are not. I hope that makes sense. Experiments have the strongest cause and effect relationships, but they're artificial and they're not always ethically possible. Think of the two examples that we're talking about: cyberbullying and suicide attempts, and violence in video games. Can you imagine a situation in which it would be ethical to randomly assign people to groups in which one group is going to experience cyberbullying and the other one won't, to see if they're more likely to commit suicide than others? No one would ever think anything like that is okay. It wouldn't be approved, and hopefully none of you think it's a good idea. Sometimes we just can't do experiments because they're not ethical or it's not possible to control the environment. So we try other methods to determine if there's a correlation between our independent variable and our dependent variable. Surveys and questionnaires are extremely common among social scientists and in particular among sociologists. They can be quantitative or qualitative, or they can include both elements. In surveys, the researcher gathers facts or numerical data to assess if an independent variable affects a dependent variable. So surveys are quantitative. Questionnaires gather facts and narrative information to assess if an independent variable affects a dependent variable. Questionnaires always include some qualitative data collection, though they may include both. And they may also be only qualitative in nature. Research questions surrounding customer satisfaction or classroom experiences are examples of either surveys, if they're just yes, no, strongly agree, disagree, and rankings. And if they ask you to provide comments, it's a questionnaire. And that can be after you've experienced shopping at Costco or Target or Verizon, or after you take this class. Both can be conducted in person, meeting someone. You oftentimes are approached by people in the mall or other places. Through email or internet, which is very common. I use SurveyMonkey a lot for surveys and questionnaires. Over the phone, which is less and less common today. Through the mail and paper and pen, or questionnaires can be conducted via interviews, face-to-face, on the phone, where a researcher asks questions and fills out the answers as the person responds. Respondents may not be truthful, or they may respond based on perceptions that are inaccurate. These are concerns that we have with surveys and questionnaires. Another option for sociological research is the secondary analysis of data, and this is really common. Researchers use existing material and data that was collected by others to assess if an independent variable has affected a dependent variable. U.S. Census data, Center for Disease Control data, etc. are all data sources in which we can get quantitative information. If we're looking at the relationship between age and suicide, age is our independent variable and suicide is our dependent variable, we can get that from CDC data. And that can give us some information based on secondary analysis. We don't have to collect the information ourselves. Or maybe we want to see if sex or gender is related to income throughout the United States. We'd use U.S. Census data. Sex is the independent variable. If you're male or female, does it impact the income the average income that people make? That's your dependent variable. So that's a quantitative analysis of secondary data. Researchers can also analyze data or material that's not numeric, but has been collected by others. A content analysis is a qualitative analysis of the content within something that has been collected prior to the researchers looking at that information. You could analyze letters, oftentimes historical letters, newspaper articles, wall paintings of prehistoric people, and other cultural artifacts like quilts, pottery, etc. Through content analysis and the secondary analysis of qualitative data, you can gain an understanding of how early civilizations perceived weather patterns and the causes through their wall paintings depicting explanations, or how slaves learned about the Underground Railroad in pre-Civil War Georgia through quilt messages, or how society has perceived crimes in the past through newspaper articles and letters among citizens. These are all qualitative ways of looking at pre-existing data and material to determine if an independent variable has affected a dependent variable, or just to explore new theories. You can only look, though, at what's already been collected, and the accuracy of some sources may be impossible to verify. If you want to look at how a general and a past president have communicated with one another, it's not always easy to verify if those letters were in fact written by that president and that general. Now let's talk about field research, the most qualitative of all types of sociological research. In this case, researchers immerse themselves in a setting. It can be in another society, another culture. It could be in another workplace, in another environment. Maybe someone joins a gang in order to understand gang culture. They use the participant observation technique, which means they're a participant in the society as well as an observer. And in ethical research, the researcher explains that they're there for that purpose. So you can imagine with gang research, it would be very difficult to gain entry because there would be concerns for the researcher's safety and also concerns about the fact that they are researching something that's criminal in some cases, and gangs may not let them in. But there are examples in which groups that engage in illicit activity have allowed researchers in. If you type into Google ethnography or field research and criminal activity or gangs, you can find some researchers that have been successful. Of course, they promise not to disclose information in order to have that success. So it's different than the kind of investigative research that police officers do. When we're doing research to gather information to gain an understanding, not to convict someone. Field research then is almost entirely qualitative. The final product of a field research study is an ethnography, which is a book or something that's written. It's a detailed study of the life and activities of people by researchers who may live with that group over a period of time. Margaret Mead studied culture and gender roles and showed that environmentally, males and females are not necessarily predestined to be dominant or submissive, that in some cultures, males will take on the role of caring for children and women in doing the primary earning, and the opposite. In some, there's more equality. So it's not predestined which it will be. Check out Margaret Mead's research if you're interested in knowing more. Nancy Shepard Hughes studied mothers in Brazil and was interested in understanding why mothers of poor cultures within Brazil were so accepting of the death of their children. And in this ethnography, through her field research, she gains an understanding of how and why that's come about in that culture. Also, Lizotte studied the warring behaviors of the Yanomami or the Yanomamo of the Amazon in Brazil to explain how and why this culture is exceptionally likely to engage in aggression and warring activities, and really how that's increased as the world has industrialized around them and they've had less and less land and resources. So these theories really would support conflict theory. You cannot easily generalize, though, to other populations with field research, and researcher bias can be very significant. So as you study the Yanomamo or the Yanomami, it's very difficult to say that the exact type of thing would happen in a different culture in Africa or another part of South America or Australia, because there are cultural factors that are specific to this one group. Also, when researchers get immersed, sometimes they themselves are very much impacted by the culture. So one has to look at researcher bias and consider that they have sort of become an insider and may not be able to maintain their objectivity. One final note: when we're exploring things, we do exploratory research. Exploratory research may have research questions without detailed hypotheses because there has not yet been much research in that area. Qualitative studies can help begin to generate theory that will later lead to more refined research with research questions and hypotheses. So oftentimes when we don't know something about a group or a culture or a subculture or a society, we do field research and really leave things very open-ended to gain a general understanding. And then after that, we start to get more specific with a secondary analysis of data, or maybe with surveys and questionnaires, and maybe someday even with experimental research.